you get a good sense of what I'm going to talk about from Michael's introduction. What I'm going to do today is to defend that picture, as well as soften it in some ways, or rather show why it's not quite as implausible as you might think, in ways I didn't address in that book. And then, in the light of this picture, which can be summed up as people are pretty rational on the whole, actually, pretty boring picture, and that's actually part of its attraction, that it's part of the reason why we should believe it. It's pretty banal. I'll go on to say a little bit about what educators can do about bad beliefs. And I know much more about the picture, which I've been developing for five years or more, actually probably 7 years, than I do about what I'm going to talk about, what educators can do. So I'm hoping you're going to be able to help me with that. All right, so it comes as no news to anyone that people believe all kinds of crazy crap, or at least they say they do. Some of these bad beliefs, what's a bad belief? I simply mean a belief, not morally bad, but a belief that is contrary to a consensus, which doesn't need to be 100%, but needs to be very high, of relevant epistemic authorities. Epistemic, I'm an epistemologist, the study of knowledge and belief. So something, and where that consensus is easily available to people. So something like climate change skepticism, where it's very easy to know what scientists say about it. If you deny that climate change is happening, or that it's a serious problem, or it's anthropogenic, you have a bad belief. Some of these bad beliefs are bizarre. I've got two there. The first one's a Obama-era survey, Pew, I believe, research, representative survey of Americans found that about a quarter of Americans said Obama was definitely or probably the Antichrist described in the Bible. More recent one, only 2/3 of millennials believe that the Earth is round. These are pretty bizarre beliefs. Or another one, which I'm going to mention occasionally, David Icke's reptilian conspiracy, according to which very senior leaders of institutions, that politicians, heads of corporations, and Queen Elizabeth, I don't know what he thinks about King Charles, are all literally shape-shifting lizards from an alien world who are dissimulating their appearance and controlling the world. 4% of Americans say they believe that leading figures in politics definitely are or probably are shape-shifting reptilians. Very bizarre. Some are much less bizarre, but they're contrary to expert opinion, like climate change belief, which is what actually motivated me to get into this debate in the first place. Or anti-vax skepticism. I think there's nothing bizarre about thinking that vaccines do more harm than good. There have indeed even been cases in which particular batches of vaccines have done more harm than good. But it's still contrary to expert opinion, and the people who hold this belief aren't in a position to know better. So what explains bad beliefs? There are two standard stories in philosophy. One is the standard story, pretty much everywhere. Most philosophers accept it, and it comes from psychology. I won't describe it in any detail, but the basic idea is that bad beliefs arise due to species-typical, more or less universal flaws in human reasoning. Something to which we're all subject to some degree, such as the confirmation bias, whereby we look for evidence in favor of a hypothesis that we would like to believe to be true. That's the confirmation bias, kick-started by motivated reasoning, and we overlook evidence against it. So that kind of process, which is no doubt is real, could explain how we end up with bad beliefs. And there are many other heuristics and biases, as psychologists say, following Kahneman and Tversky. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics, which could play a role in explaining bad beliefs. That's a story you'll find in the Quality Press, for example. It's a very common story to explain bad beliefs. Philosophers sometimes add to this or replace it with a epistemic vice or intellectual vice account, according to which bad beliefs arise from blameworthy, rather than species typical and universal, blameworthy character flaws in your intellectual character, like dogmatism, closed-mindedness, intellectual arrogance. They might explain bad belief. Perhaps I'm so intellectually arrogant, I think I know better than the scientists. That could be the explanation. It's no part of my picture to deny that these things could be part of the story. Indeed, probably are part of the story. I don't think they're a major part of the story. Even together, I don't think they do real heavy lifting, particularly in some cases. I refer you to my friend Douglas the Dachshund, who's extremely skeptical about this story. Come on. I'm subject to the confirmation bias, so I overlook evidence against the reptile hypothesis and I end up believing it. Douglas and I just don't believe it. I mean, come on, how do I end up with that? I'm arrogant. I end up thinking that Democrats are holding children hostage in the basement of a pizza restaurant in DC in order to conduct satanic rituals. Look, the thing is, we must be reasonably well designed for belief assessment, to acquire beliefs and to update them on the way of, in the light of evidence. The reason we must be designed that way is beliefs matter. In a very well-worn metaphor, beliefs are maps. They are representations of the way the world must be, the way that I take the world to be. And if I don't have an accurate map, I run aground. Just, this is still the metaphor. We can imagine this spatially, taking the metaphor quite literally. If I want to get to this room from University Station, I've got to have a representation of the layout of the university. Or I end up walking into the canal, or who knows. But I've also got to have representation of what canals are. What happens if you try to cross a canal where there's no bridge? But I also have to represent a representation of all kinds of abstract stuff, like what a lecture is. If I don't have these things, then who knows? I stand in the corner making beeping noises like a robot that's malfunctioning. And if we didn't evolve to have these things, we wouldn't survive. So we can be confident evolution selected for reasonably accurate belief formation processes. Well, so while I think intellectual vices and thinking dispositions have an effect, they generally do have an effect, and on occasion they can lead to badly justified beliefs. It's very hard to see how they can explain something so strongly at variance with all the evidence. Better explanation for bizarre beliefs, at least, and I think also for many bad beliefs that are not bizarre, at least as psychologists say, to explain some of the variance about not bizarre beliefs, and a great deal of the variance about bizarre beliefs, is people don't believe these things in the first place. They're just saying they believe them. Douglas the Duckfoot and I think people can't be serious when they say these things. Even if they think they're serious, something else must be going on. They're insincere often. There are three routes to bad beliefs, to insincere or false reporting of beliefs that one doesn't in fact hold. I'm only going to talk about two tonight. They're both routes to insincere expression of belief. One is expressive responding, and the other one is sheer trolling. Expressive responding is what it sounds like. When somebody makes an assertion, sounds like they're expressing a belief, but really they're expressing an attitude. So, Birmingham example, if I say, Villa are without doubt the best team in the world, would I really bet a huge amount on Villa beating Barca or Real Madrid or Manchester City? No. My behavior would show that I'm not expressing a belief, I'm expressing an attitude. Yay, Villa! Okay, so it's one thing to say this happens, but is there evidence? Actually, there's lots of evidence. A lot of it's equivocal, that is, I think it's right, but it's open to other interpretations. I'm just going to talk about this one study, which I think is absolutely compelling. First Trump term, I hate I have to say first Trump term. First Trump term example, and I'll have a second one from the first Trump term later. You might remember, if you haven't been lucky enough to scrub your brain of it, just after Trump's inauguration, his then press secretary, Sean Spicer, said it had been the biggest such event ever. This was clearly false. And this was the incident that led Kellyanne Conway, the Trump surrogate, to coin the phrase alternative facts, or actually borrow it from different contexts, to say Spicer was putting the alternative facts. Brian Schaffner and Samantha Luke, who had an uncommonly good ethics approval, were able to run this study within days of that story hitting the headlines. They took photos of the Trump inauguration and the first Obama inauguration. Both these are photos of the Washington Mall, taken from almost the same angle. And they simply asked which photo had more people in it. They didn't ask, whose inauguration was attended by more people, who had the better inauguration, nothing like that. They didn't even label them. They just said, here are two photos, which photo has more people in it? They relied on people recognizing the photos, understanding the context, and they guessed, taking the opportunity to express an attitude. And in fact, 15% of Trump voters, as opposed to 2% of Clinton voters, chose this photo as having more people in it. Now, you might think, philosophers talk about, cognitive scientists talk about the cognitive penetration of perception, how your belief might make a difference to what you actually perceive. That might be a real thing. I think the current evidence suggests that it's not real, or very, very subtle if it exists. But on the strongest story of cognitive penetration, it just cannot be the case that people could look at these two photos and say, yep, that has more people in it. It must be expressing an attitude. If you deny that, well, I refer you to my friend Douglas the Duckfoot. By the way, this study replicates. My postdoc and I replicated it a couple of years ago. Smaller effect sizes you'd expect, fewer people recognize the photos, but it still replicates. So that's expressive responding. Reporting a belief in order to express an attitude. Lots of beliefs are politically charged in one way or another. I might say, I believe vaccines are harmful. Why? Because I support Trump. Yeah, and Trump is associated through Robert Kennedy in particular with vaccine skepticism. I might say climate change isn't real, again, because I want to, maybe I don't want to express my support of one side, maybe I want to say screw the Democrats, or screw the Liberals, or screw whatever group I associated with that. So that's one route to insincere report. Here's another one. Sheer trolling. Trolling I'm using to mean reporting something, either because you just think it's funny to report that, or because you like making people angry or upset. You know, what they call on social media rage bait. Some people like that for some reason. I don't entirely understand these motivations, but it's real. No doubt that it's real. This is the second first Trump term example. You might remember some typically ill-judged remarks by Trump about bleach and coronavirus. They weren't quite as stupid as they were presented as being. They were just normal, you know, Trump sort of diarrhea. But after the polarization machine got to work on them, they became, Trump said you should drink bleach, and it became widely reported that Trump supporters were actually drinking bleach to prevent COVID. And there were anecdotal reports of people turning up at emergency rooms with burns to the esophagus. Well, anecdotes is one thing. Any evidence? The CDC did a study. A reasonably small study, only 500 participants, but enough for assuming a decent effect size. Representative, you know, a panel of Americans chosen for representativeness of the general population, and they asked them about how their habits had changed since COVID, and they found, among other things, that 4% of Americans were reported they were drinking bleach or other household cleaners in order to prevent COVID. And this was widely reported at the time. Is it true? Littman and colleagues replicated this study. Replication is very important, as we know lots of studies don't replicate. With a bigger sample, so greater experimental power, greater capacity to detect effects, and greater certainty that any effect that you are detecting isn't by chance. And they actually got a bigger effect. 8% of Americans reporting that they're drinking bleach and other household cleaners to prevent COVID. But Littman and colleagues went further. They included checks for what they call problematic respondents. Attention checks are routine in psychology, where you just put in a catch question, make sure people are paying attention. You know, I don't know. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. Select strongly disagree in answer to this question. If you're not paying attention, you might choose something else, and then your data is excluded. That's routine, but they put sincerity checks in addition. These are questions designed to catch trolls. Things like, have you ever died from a heart attack? Can you name every US senator ever from memory? Do you know what the word whatlet means? Have you ever used the internet? If you answered yes to any of these questions, your data was excluded. You were a problematic respondent and not confident that you're answering sincerely. Excluding all the problematic respondents, Littman and colleagues were left with 11 people. They then drilled down into those 11 people. 10 of them, on further interview, reported that either they had drunk cleaning products, but they'd done it by accident. They'd mistaken it for something else. Or they had accidentally clicked yes in response to the question. That left exactly one person who passed all the sincerity checks and claimed to have drunk cleaning products to prevent coronavirus. That one person, although he'd passed all the sincerity checks, reported his weight as 1,700 pounds and his height as 100 meters. He too is a problematic respondent. To a first approximation, no one was drinking bleach to combat coronavirus. They were trolls, essentially. And I'll just quickly report some of our own research. This is Rob Ross and I, my postdoc. We gave our panel of Australian respondents, this was conducted through YouGov Australia, reasonably high-powered research, from memory about 1,200 respondents. We gave them 7 conspiracy theories, 6 of which had been studied in the Australian context before. So we had a baseline for how widely support for these conspiracy theories is reported. And we found we got pretty similar or typical patterns. You know, a climate change, a 5G one, a COVID one, QAnon for Australia. But this final one, I'm not giving you all 7, it hasn't been studied before. And the reason it hasn't been studied before is we made it up. That the Canadian Armed Forces have been secretly developing an elite army of genetically engineered, super intelligent giant raccoons to invade nearby countries. We don't think, Rob, me and Douglas the Dachshund, don't think that people really believe this. If they do, we're responsible. We think if they're answering yes to that question, they're probably insincere. Here's what we found. Endorsing that raccoons conspiracy theory is a strong predictor of endorsing the others. So among those who endorsed raccoons, just over 4 other conspiracy theories were also endorsed. Endorsed means definitely or probably true on our Likert scale. Among those who rejected raccoons, they endorsed only 0.5 of one of those 6. That was the median. It looks as though conspiratorial belief is strongly, not solely, but strongly driven by sheer trolling. And you might think, well, people who accept conspiracy theories are just really, really gullible, and they'll say, yep, I believe that, or whatever you tell them. But we note that 2 of the conspiracy theories are contradictory. Just going back, that coronavirus is a myth, and governments are covering up that 5G network spread coronavirus. Half of the people who endorsed raccoons endorsed both of those 2 contradictory conspiracy theories, compared to only 2% of people who rejected raccoons. Okay, so I don't think conspiracy theory belief is all trolling or expressive responding at all. I think there are lots of sincere believers out there, but I do think it's greatly exaggerated, the number, and not just conspiracy theories, but particularly the more bizarre ones. It's greatly exaggerated by polling, which doesn't check for sincerity. And when you accept that, my story becomes less shocking, that people are, on the whole, pretty rational. Yeah, there's some problem going on here. There's a problem with these people who are reporting, yep, raccoons, I think Canada's breeding raccoon super soldiers, why not? There's some sort of problem going on, but it's not a defect of belief formation, because they're not forming beliefs. So my explanation is actually pretty banal, which is that people believe the things they do, most of the things they do, because others they trust, they regard as reliable, tell them so. It's a really, really boring story. It's also a completely general story for your typical person who genuinely believes climate change is a myth, a Chinese hoax or whatever it might be, and genuinely believes it almost certainly on the basis of what philosophers call testimony, which is simply other people saying so. Testimonies need not be formal. It's not like in a courtroom. Testimony is just philosopher's word for other people telling me stuff, roughly. So climate change skeptics believe on testimony. So do I. I'm not a climate change skeptic. But why do I believe that climate change is happening? It's largely anthropogenic in origin, and it's a really serious threat to human well-being because people I regard as reliable have told me so. So it's a general story. It's also a story that applies very broadly to all kinds of beliefs. And the fact that we know it applies very broadly to all kinds of beliefs, we can't doubt it, it makes it plausible as an explanation for bad beliefs too. Why do I think it's that we know that reliance on testimony is so pervasive? Well, just think about all the stuff you know that you can only know because people you regard as reliable have told you. Most of you know who your parents are, but only because you've been told. You know, you were there when you were born, but you don't remember it. Somebody has told you who your parents are, and that's why you know it. Probably more than one person. You've probably got convergent testimony from a variety of sources, but it's still testimony. What your birth date is. Every historical fact about your family, your town, your country, you didn't see any of it, prior to your birth, so you're reliant on testimony. All the political facts. Who's the Prime Minister? What party does he represent? What are their policies? They have policies, no really. All of this you know on testimony. You've read it in the press, you've talked about it with other people, you've seen it on TV. But even if you know Keir Starmer personally, that is the Prime Minister is something, it's a social fact. It's not something you can observe. You know all that because you're inculcated into a culture in which facts like that make sense. Indirectly, you're reliant on testimony for all of that. It's obviously true about specialist knowledge. I'm going to use science as my prime example, but this is true for history, for example, as well. How do I know the Holocaust happened? On the basis of testimony? As in my case, I've actually got familial testimony, but it's still testimony. I wasn't there. For most people, it's the testimony of historians, directly or indirectly, which is responsible for their knowledge that the Holocaust occurred, or that there was a Second World War at all. You can't go out and verify it for yourself. Not really. How do I know that climate change is real? On the basis of testimony. Just think about what it would be for me to go out and verify this for myself. I could set up, if I was rich enough, weather stations around the world. In that case, it's not clear I wouldn't be relying on testimony. I'd be, relying on the data from the weather stations. That looks like a kind of testimony to me. But in addition, I'd need to look at historical data to see how climate has changed. So I'd need records. That's testimony. I can't go and don't live long enough to observe climate change over time. And I've got to correlate that with CO2 emissions. And again, I'm reliant on all kinds of other sources of data to measure it for myself. When we say, with any sort of sensible, rationale in mind, do your own research, we don't mean, go to Auschwitz and do a chemical analysis on the so-called shower rooms there and see what chemicals were sprayed there. Even if we did do that, we'd still be dependent on testimony. This is Auschwitz. This is the shower room. That these machines I'm using to do a chemical analysis are reliable. What we really mean is go and read what experts have said, or more likely, go and read popularizations of what experts have said, which put it in a format we can understand. Because if you actually go and read the technical literature, it's like, I don't know what's going on. For very many questions, you can read the technical literature in history, but assessing it requires specialist expertise, as the sad story of Naomi Wolf illustrates. Naomi Wolf was embarrassed on air when she was talking about her new book, 2019, and She was, it was central to her book, which was about what she claimed was an increase in oppression of gay people, so-called homosexuals, probably sodomites at the time, in the 19th century. And it was central to her case that judges started using the phrase death recorded in their judgments for the first time. She interpreted that as meaning they'd been put to death, and before it wasn't happening. And it so happened her interviewer had a DPhil in cultural history and said, that's not what it means. It means the judge was recording that a death sentence was a sentence set down by law as appropriate in a case like this, but that they were not exercising it in this case. And at the time, people said, why didn't she get her book fact-checked? But she had. First of all, it was based on her own DPhil, which had gone through specialist reviewers. But second of all, she'd gone a step further and asked Dame Helena Kennedy, very prominent legal scholar and lawyer, to read the manuscript. And Helena Kennedy said, yep, I think this is all right. I mean, she had some suggestions, and Naomi Wolf made some changes. But she didn't pick up the central problem. Why? Because expertise is highly specialized. It's not enough to be a lawyer. You've got to know about a particular area of 19th century law to pick up the error. And we see this happening, I won't give you more examples, in history repeatedly, with people making mistakes of this kind of mistake because they haven't consulted a colleague with the very specialist knowledge. They think, I know about this sort of thing, but in fact, it's an area in which there's highly specialist knowledge, and their knowledge doesn't carry over. Experts themselves, as this illustrates, are dependent on testimony. Science, I'm going back to science, it's a highly, highly distributed enterprise. Science is done by individuals specializing not in a field, not in a subfield, but in a subfield. Working with others who specialize in a subfield in order to put together a larger picture, or just doing their work in the subfield and making their finding and relying on other people, who have kind of bridging expertise, but not expertise of that specific sort, to put it together. That's how we know about climate change. There aren't people who have done the work for themselves, which allows them to know that climate change is a serious problem. All kinds of different people, physicists, computer scientists, glaciologists, geologists, and even people in the social sciences have established the science of climate change, working together and often in conflict with one another by attempting to rebut one another's theories. Even scientists are highly dependent on testimony. Alexander Bird gives this example which illustrates kind of cross-field dependence. A paleontologist might use radiometric dating to date an artifact or a bone. They probably know the general principles of radiometric dating, but they can't build the machines for themselves. They're not a physicist, they're not an engineer. They're reliant on the expertise of others. That's a cross field, but even within fields, expertise is highly specialized. I'm author like 170 on several papers. It's not special in a couple of ways. One way it's not special is author position 170 is not a great author position. It's not something people covet. But the other way it's not special is it's not that unusual. Papers with, I don't know if the record's been broken yet, but in high energy physics and particle physics, papers with 5,000 authors are not unknown. That's highly unusual, but papers with 200 authors, quite common. Quite often, if you go and read a paper in Nature, it'll have, Spener, and the ABC Collaboration Group, asterisks. You can go and find out who they are, because there's just too many to list. All of those people contribute something different to the paper. That's why they're there. They're not redundant. The last person probably brought funding, but all the rest made an intellectual contribution, however small. They can't replicate each other's work. They can't even check each other's work, often just for lack of time, because a single paper may represent literally centuries of data analysis spread over 500 people. But also because of lack of skills. Hardwick gives this example 40 years ago of interviewing physicists about a paper. And he said, how did you calculate that result? And I don't know, you have to ask the people who did it. How would you go about calculating it? I don't know, I'd ask the people who did it. There are physicists working on a physics paper, but physics itself is highly specialized. We're dependent on testimony. We're not automatically, reflexively dependent on testimony. We're not gullible. We actually filter testimony by reference to a variety of different cues. It's been well studied. Paul Harris's book is looking at the use of these cues in children. It's an old book now, it's 2012, but he's got much more recent work. It's been studied in adults too by Dan Sperber, among others. We use cues like competence. Well, that's not surprising. Competent person is more likely to be right. We assess competence in a domain-specific way. Even children are sensitive to, is this the sort of thing that they might know about? We assess testimony by reference to plausibility. That too is completely rational. If I'm asking how to get to University Station from here and somebody says, well, the way to do it is, you've got to find the right manhole, right? And then find the manhole and then climb down the ladder. You can only get through the sewers. I think I'm going to say, I think I'll ask someone else. I'm just going to reject the implausible testimony. I'm not going to trust somebody who gives me implausible testimony. Although these things are weighed against each other. I will accept it if enough people tell me you can only get there via the sewers and they're independent of each other. I think, God, Birmingham's a weird place. And the final one we use is values. That may not seem so rational, but I think it is rational. We prefer testimony, as I say. Even children prefer testimony from those who they see as benevolent. That's not surprising, because after all, malevolent people are more likely to be not care about whether they mislead you. They might tell me that the way to get to University Station is via the sewers, because they're malevolent. Even if they're not outright trying to deceive me, they may not care whether it's relevant to me, but also they may not be assessing evidence well. The fact that they've got bad values may indicate that they've got a rational problem. Why have they got such bad values? There must be something, must have some defect of reasoning that makes them think, that's okay. But also, I'm more confident that they take the right things into account. So, if I'm asking an economist about whether we should have a tax on carbon emissions, their values, whether they share my values, might be relevant to the answer, because I know that they take into account, let's say, the effects of the policy and of climate change itself on the poorest people, whereas somebody who's got different political values might be more concerned with GDP and less concerned with the effect on the distribution of that GDP. So it's rational to take values into account as well, and people do. And that's what we see. Why do people accept, say, the science of climate change? Because people they see as competent in virtue of the fact they possess degrees and publications and, they're members of learned societies and so on, look like they're competent, and seem to share the right values, or at least not have the wrong values. Tell them it's true. Why do other people reject it? Because those people they see as competent, perhaps in virtue of belonging to a think tank, or perhaps being a politician who they take to be informed by people in think tanks, who have the right values. They value free markets. Strongest predictor of climate change belief, at least prior to Trump, was market individualism, as Kahan calls it. They have the right values. I trust them, and that's what they tell me. On the other hand, these people I distrust tell me there's not so. Well, why would I believe them? Very quickly, the evidence for motivated reasoning is surprisingly poor, because most of the research just doesn't take people's prior beliefs into account. It doesn't take people's trust relations into account. More technically, it's coming to be accepted that a Bayesian account of belief update does just as well in explaining the data as a motivated reasoning account. So quite a few psychologists now think that's experimentally intractable with a motivated reasoning or Bayesian account. Well, I think the Bayesian account wins because we know it's true and so pervasively. All right, finally, what should educators do about bad beliefs? Well, as Michael's already said, I think critical thinking, and for that matter, educating for the epistemic virtues, while I think they're great things to do, I don't expect a huge payoff from them, because it's not a lack of epistemic virtue. It's not an inability to think clearly that's explaining bad beliefs. Rather, people are responding pretty rationally to their evidence as they see it, and they have grounds for seeing it that way. Internally available grounds. They're going wrong, but from their own perspective, they've lined things up properly. They're responding to evidence in the way that a detective should respond to evidence, even when we, the reader, know that the evidence is misleading. We know that the knife's been planted and the CCTV camera footage has been doctored. So we know that the butler didn't do it. But we would think that something pretty weird is going on if the detective sees the CCTV footage, finds the butler's fingerprints on the knife, and knows the butler has a motive and says, well, it certainly wasn't the butler. They'd be getting right by accident. That's not what they should be doing. They should be responding to their evidence. That's what people are doing in general. So the real problem is that people are trusting the wrong sources. Now, getting people to trust the right sources largely is a matter of institutional response. In a slogan, if we want right sources to be trusted, we've got to do more to make them trustworthy. And too often, they haven't been trustworthy, at least for particular segments of the population. Vaccine skepticism is overrepresented among Black Americans. That's not coincidental. There's a shameful history of medical neglect and worse, and not just the history, and epistemic and other injustices in medicine continue with regard to women, and particularly Black women in the United States, and no doubt in this country too, although I think it's a smaller effect here. So it's not surprising that Black people have lower trust in medical authorities. What educators can do is to model trustworthiness by being trustworthy, because what we want, I think a major aim of education should be bringing people to trust in genuinely trustworthy sources. We are pervasively dependent epistemically, and of course in other ways too. And we must be able to bring those people we educate to trust, put their trust in the right places. So that should be the content of education, that we must trust, who we must trust, why we can trust. Making trust explicit in the educational process, I think, should be a part of it. Why is science trustworthy? For the most part. Although I don't, and I'm going to go on to say a little bit about this, I don't think we should be, telling lies, idealizing science. We shouldn't be hiding when it has failed and continues to fail. because it's not always trustworthy. There are areas in which it continues to be less trustworthy. Possibly still better than the alternatives, but not something you can put a huge amount of weight on. So talking about what makes science trustworthy, which is largely that it's a social enterprise, in which diverse perspectives are brought to bear on a common problem, diverse disciplinary expertise, but also a diverse range of backgrounds. Feminist philosophers of science have developed this picture in sort of detail that obviously I'm not going to be able to touch on here. For that matter, Naomi Oreskes, in her recent book, relatively recent book, talks about this. And because science is structured so that this kind of criticism for multiple perspectives is institutionalized through peer review and post-publication review in particular. Why, on the other hand, are other people less trustworthy? I think we should be asking what motives might people have to present themselves as trustworthy, independently of whether they are. I think that should be part of the content of education. So, some people say if you want people to trust science, you mustn't let them see how it's being made, because it's incredibly messy and it's fallible. I think, given that people are pretty rational on the whole, actually, there's no point presenting them with an idealized picture of science, because they're going to find out it's not like that. They're going to read about scandals in science, which is, it's kind of fascinating stuff. And there have been many, many cases of outright fraud over the years. If you want slightly depressing reading, go and read the blog Retraction Watch, which tracks papers in science as they're retracted by journals, which doesn't happen as quickly as it should, either through fraud, very often through inadvertent error, but nevertheless producing unreliable science. We should not be presenting an idealized picture of science, but we certainly shouldn't be presenting the picture of science, which is all too common, of the lone genius in definitely his attic or office, having a eureka moment and overturning orthodoxy, because basically none of that happens. Orthodoxy is almost never overturned, arguably never overturned, depending on how big a change you think you need to overturn orthodoxy. And it never happens through this lone genius. I worked in a neuroscience institute for 4 years. Very smart people, but they're not that smart. They're not out of the range of ordinary encounters. They're pretty ordinary, clever people of the time, the kind you all know, who just happen to have a special training and are embedded in institutions in which they work together. And I think if we teach how heavily dependent we all are on each other epistemically, the attraction of do-it-your-own research just vanishes. On the one hand, people shouldn't think, having had a realistic picture of knowledge in general, not just science, that think, I can go out and find out for myself, all by myself, ignoring everything that's been done before. This is not the kind of thing we can do. It's not the kind of thing anyone can do, not even, the smartest scientist. They too are deeply dependent on others. And with a realistic picture of science in mind, they should approach anyone who says, only I know, everyone else is wrong, listen to me, I have seen the truth. Like, I don't know, Brett Weinstein or so many other podcasters. That's holding up a flag and saying, look at me, I'm a grifter. And when if you've taught, that knowledge is heavily, heavily social. We should be able to see that as just a huge red flag, claiming that you have overturned the orthodoxy or you've struck out on your own. Everyone else is subject to groupthink. I also think we should be more realistic about the role of values in science. Values are ineliminable. You can't eliminate them because your research priorities are value-driven. What do you choose to investigate, how you choose to investigate it, but also in the research itself, what's more important? Wrongly believing something to be true when it's actually false, or wrongly rejecting something when it's actually true. That's a value judgment. And that's how you set your thresholds for evidentiary value. You can't avoid making that judgment. And I think we should be reflexive about the role of values in science. That is, scientists should acknowledge or recognize that that they make value judgments, and they should talk about it, and these things should be open to, democratic deliberation. In general, scientists make very reasonable values judgments. Often they're not just reasonable, but almost forced upon them by, it's just obvious that this is a really serious, you really don't want to take the risk of wrongly believing something if it's false. That this is carcinogenic, or that this is safe for children. So if you're wrong about that, something you really want to avoid, so you set your evidentiary standards high. But we should be reflexive and deliberative about it and communicate it, because sometimes these value judgments are open to debate, and sometimes they are, entailing that certain groups will bear burdens and others will benefit. And they may not be reasonable choices. In any case, they're things that should be open to democratic debate. Finally, my message has been, on the whole, people are pretty rational, actually. That, too, is something I think we should be stressing. We should, we should recognize how much trolling and expressive responding is going on, that there's some sort of problem here, but it's not a problem of rationality, understood narrowly as to do with belief formation. And those people who are sincere believers, sincere but mistaken, of which there are many, I'm not, some on pretty much any topic, and many on some topics, they're also rational. Doing so, I think, might play a role in making us more receptive to testimony from other people. If you're not going to dismiss them as, just dumb Democrats or I don't know what the right epithet is for Trump supporters. And it's my own political biases make it much harder for me to recognize the rationality on that side. But it is there. And, once we recognize our common rationality, perhaps we'll be slightly more receptive to testimony from each other. And I think that's our best hope. Thank you.